Whoa, whoa, whoa. What's up, everyone? Welcome. I was going to put together a big montage for this, but I really just want to get a couple words out because McCain has been all over the news. I'm sure you have an opinion about it. What's my opinion about it? I'm going to share it with you. I kind of want to change the conversation. When you're arguing about whether you thought he was a good senator or a bad senator, whether he was in office too long, or I would say too short, but you can't say that, whether the flag should be a full staff or half-mast, I feel like the conversation really needs to center around the 17th Amendment. I'm going to make my case for why that is. So I'm going to pull up my my handy dandy screen over here and talk about some of the stuff that I've seen with John McCain. Now, I was doing a guest hit on a radio station about 2 weeks ago, and every time this particular host, who's a friend of mine, would talk about Senator, hold on a sec, still getting the hang of the streaming thing. We'll do it live. Every time John McCain or Jeff Flake, I'm from Arizona, so these are sensitive issues for us, would come up, it'd be these long rants about what they did well and what they didn't do and why we can't get rid of them and blah, blah, blah. And during one of these sessions, I said, look, what really needs to happen is we need to focus on repealing the 17th Amendment. Then we wouldn't have to waste our breaths with this. And he looked at me during the break, not on air, and said, which one's the 17th Amendment again? And I thought, oh man, this is your job. You're supposed to be really good at this. The 17th Amendment. The one that would not allow us to have a Senator McCain. The founders put together an amazing system to prevent people from dying in office, and well, as often as they do in the Senate. And we've screwed it up. So let's talk about that a little bit. Now, before I do, obviously there's the things I have to say, like I would never, his body's still warm. I would never rip on him. There's no dishonor in death, yada, yada. But I'm hearing that and seeing that everywhere that I go. I mean, I have a list of, I could go to the news articles I have here where this one I thought was pretty funny. Why John McCain would never make it in today's Republican Party. CNN might have gotten that one right. But all the different things we should be saying about Trump, the fact that he was praised by CARE, I forget the guy's Oohaleyeah or whatever his name was from CARE. He got props from George Soros. Like, I don't think that's a big deal because that's what you do when someone dies, and left it's someone the left hates that loves Donald Trump. You probably wouldn't see that, but there's nothing wrong with that. I'm fine with it. There are people debating about how long you have to wait before discussing McCain-Feingold or the Gang of Eight or the Songbird issue or his mistake on the flight deck that got dozens of sailors killed, or the fact that he was pardoned after he got out of Vietnam, which I always thought was a little weird. Or even more recently, when I was more involved in politics, the way he attacked Romney mercilessly in the primaries in 2008, when I thought Romney was the better candidate. Not sure I felt that way in 2012. But after the primaries, when we got into the general, he turned into this apologist puppy dog for Obama who wouldn't say anything about it, but he just kind of started carrying his water for him. He was McCain and Enable. And so I don't even want to talk about that. There's plenty of that all over the net. And in this article, particularly from the Federalist, just talked about all the amazing things he did and the great life that he led. And this leads to one of my other frustrations about McCain. In how many Vietnam veterans got treated like total dirt? How many today still feel like they never got the honor and don't get the honor they deserve? And here you've got someone like McCain who, and this is as an Arizona voter who hears this every 6 years, how wonderful McCain is and how much he served and how much he sacrificed for the country. And I just think, would Braveheart say, does the man who bleeds and dies on the battlefield, does he sacrifice less? Like, who has parlayed military service into a more lucrative, profitable career than John McCain? It almost makes John Kerry blush. And that's always been a frustration for me. Say what you will about him. I don't like that. And it goes back to the argument of the 17th Amendment. It should not be this way. And then you get this self-fawning in Washington today. It's really straight out of The Office. Have you seen the episode where Michael Scott, his old boss, who nobody in his office knows, dies? He gets a call that he's dead, and he's sad. And he goes in and announces it to everybody, and they kind of just don't care. It's like Twitter, right? Everyone's over it the next day, and which is what will happen with John McCain. So I'm glad he got his time in the limelight. But Michael Scott sees this reaction and really gets upset because it's a foreshadowing of what's going to happen to him when he dies. So he wants to celebrate. He wants to get everybody in the mood, wants to make it a much bigger deal than it is to them because he gets to see how they're going to treat him when he's gone, and he's just not okay with that. I feel like I see that in Washington with how big of a deal they make it to make sure all the buildings are half staff and it's running around the clock 24 hours a day. And I just think every other Vietnam War vet is looking at this going, even the ones who don't hate him for some of the things that happened in Vietnam. Like, why do we do this? Because he didn't quit the cushiest job that you could possibly have on planet Earth for 30 years, except maybe the job Tom Hanks had in Big, where he just played with toys, and said, I don't get it. It's a building. I don't get it. I love the movie Big, by the way. So I want to spend a few minutes talking about the 17th Amendment. And when you get into discussions about John McCain or whatever the next senator is that's been there for 40 years, this is something that needs to come up. Because if I was ever elected to Senate, I'd be a one-issue voter / senator. It would be, I'm here to repeal the 17th Amendment. Let's talk about why that is. And by the way, I was on Meghan McCain's Twitter feed for just a little while, and she had someone on there who said, I just want to thank, I mean, there's tons and tons of accolades and love on there, which is great. But she said, I just want to thank your father for spending his life fighting fascism. And I think she was referring to the last year when he was hating on Trump. And I thought, how many fascists would dream of having the run that John McCain had in office? That would tickle them pink to look at the second most powerful position maybe in the country and say, I could spend 3 decades doing that for sure. And this is from someone who, John McCain's been in Congress just about a year less than I've been alive. And I've lived in Arizona my whole life. So we see a lot of John McCain every 6 years when he's not the maverick, when he's the guy that wants to fight for the people of Arizona. And then he becomes the maverick and he makes headlines and he goes across the aisle, and it's frustrating. But all that aside, I want to look at this article from CNN where they posted, CNBC, where they posted the statement that John McCain had prepared for them to read after he was dead, ostensibly with Donald Trump still not being allowed to go to the funeral. It talks about 2 interesting things. I want to talk about the second one, the wrap, when it says, 10 years ago, I had the privilege to concede defeat in the election for president. That's weird, because early in the article, he's attacking McCain. He talks about how, let me see what the line is. Speaking of country's best qualities, McCain wrote that we weaken our greatness when we confuse our patriotism with tribal rivalries that have sown resentment and hatred and violence in all corners of the globe. Like most politicians, McCain's never done this, right? He was never a participant in that. Quote, we weaken it when we hide behind walls rather than tear them down. I was astonished because from seeing his election videos every 6 years, the guy ran on 2 things: strong immigration, build the wall. At least since I've been an adult, that's all we ever hear. And now, when he's on his deathbed, it would just be better if we could quit hiding behind walls and tear him down. This aggravates me so much. There's a Simpsons episode where Marge starts getting on Homer's case, and he goes, well, everything looks bad if you remember it. And that's what I think of when I read these lines. It's ridiculous. But at the end of the letter, after taking a shot at Trump, which whatever, didn't like each other, quote, 10 years ago, I had the privilege to concede defeat in the election for president. That's awesome. Praising Obama for being better than him while taking shots at Trump. That's the maverick, my friends. I want to end my farewell to you with the heartfelt faith in Americans that I felt so powerfully that evening. I feel it powerfully still. Do you feel it? I'm going to go Deadpool right here. Do you feel it? Where do you feel it? Describe the feeling for me. Do not despair of our present difficulties, but believe always in the promise of greatness of America. Because nothing is inevitable here. Americans never quit. We never surrender. We never hide from history. We make history. Blah, blah, blah. In that line, nothing is inevitable, except for one thing. Senators will die in office, and it wasn't always that way. In the words of the good master, in the beginning, it was not so. Americans never quit, especially John McCain when he's in the Senate. The dude had brain cancer for 18 months and would not give up his seat, would not go to work, just wanted to hang on so we could have this big charade at the end. I'm going to say something I'll regret. It just frustrates me because it's not supposed to be about the man or the civil servant or getting wealthy and cushy in Washington. It's supposed to be about serving your country. So here's a list of the longest serving senators ever in the U.S. Senate. There are 25 of them on this list. Now, you can make jokes about which ones are Republicans and Democrats and which ones were Democrats and then Republicans, but that's not why I'm looking at this. I'm doing it because I believe I counted three of them who served their term after the 17th Amendment was passed. 3 of 25. You could go down the top 50. You're probably going to see a similar percentage. Look at these years. 51 years. Robert C. Byrd started in 1959, died in 2010. He was a Grand Kleagle in the Ku Klux Klan, but as Bill Clinton said, well, he's just a country boy. You know, I had to do it to get elected up there. That's what you got to do. You got to pretend you hate black people. And you know, it worked really well. It worked for 60 years. You know, he's been riding that out. I like it. I got a lot of respect for that guy. That's someone I want on my team in my office. Number 2, Daniel Inouye, I think I'm saying it wrong, almost 50 years, started in 63. Strom Thurmond started in 54. You have to go down to Carl Hayden, another Arizona guy. Got to go down to Francis E. Warren from Wyoming, started in 1890, and it is last term in 1929. So that's one. You've got 2. Ellis and D. Smith started in 1909. The 17th Amendment was passed about 100 years ago in the teens. And so maybe you count Kenneth D. McKellar, I think it was 2018, that started their, and that's 1 year overlap, that started their term after that happens. Why is that important? Because the founders set up the system so there was checks and balances in all the divisions of government. And when it comes to Senator McCain, they wanted people to not look like monarchists. They didn't want him staying in office for 50 years. You look at the turnover rate and the re-election rate for the first 150 years of our country, it's minimal compared to what it was today because it wasn't a cushy job for life. It was actual service. Here's an incumbency radar for the first 108 Congresses from 1793 to 2003. Now, the gray down here is unresolved data. They're not exactly sure what happened. But what you can see, the yellow is people who sought re-election and won. Looks like it's right around 50%, maybe 60 back and forth through the trend. You start to see people who didn't seek re-election. It's pretty high through here. It starts to taper off in the early 1900s. Now, the early 1900s were, I think, Paul Johnson called the 1960s America's suicide attempt. The early 1900s were definitely our constitutional suicide pact. We passed some of the worst amendments that we have. We passed the socialized income tax. We passed the Federal Reserve. We passed the 17th Amendment to elect senators popularly. We passed a couple other really awful ones that I won't mention. One of them has been repealed. But what essentially happened is they said, look, if we've got the different branches of government, we're going to have a president who's elected by the Electoral College, which represent the states. We're going to let the people who represent the House get reelected every 2 years. So if we go to war or we're spending money in a way people don't like, in 2 years they can get them out. And the people can vote on that depending on how they feel. But the states, we're going to preserve their sovereignty and federalism by making sure that the state legislatures choose the representatives they want to represent their state at the National Council. And for 110 years, that worked pretty well until they said, you know what? There's just not enough democracy here. Like, we need the popular vote to determine who represent the states because we want to make sure they're representing the people. What happened? They passed the 17th Amendment, and as you can see right here, the incumbency rate skyrocketed. The exact opposite happened. People could come home for a couple months every 6 years and say they represent the people and have a 90+% chance overall of getting reelected. War chest, special interest, connections in Washington, people patting each other's backs. Completely the wrong move. Why do we do this? Why do we do it? Look at this. Here's the U.S. House reelection rates just from 64 to 2014. I couldn't find any that went back further. But you would see they go from about 50% at the turn of the 1800s to, what is this, 85, 90% on average. I think the House rate's actually closer to 95%. The Senate race on average is over 80%. It's ridiculous. These guys stay in office for life, which is why you have this list of who's dying in office. By the way, John McCain doesn't even break the top 25. He's like 5 years away from the top 25. And I'd be really curious to go in here and look at how many of them are also just in the last 100 years when we had this ridiculous amendment. So when this comes up and people are talking about John McCain, you should ask, how do you feel about the 17th Amendment? Do you think it's time to repeal it? Because it is. There are some defenses for it that I've been reading about in terms of what would happen if we changed the law. And none of them are very good. I think that it actually backfired. They wanted to make sure, like you hear today with the presidential election, Hillary won the popular vote. Well, guess what? The Senate's job was to protect the states from the interests of the national popular vote. Now, when you have an election, like say the one in Alabama with Roy Moore and the Democrat who's going to last for about 2 years, why do I care who they elect in Alabama? I shouldn't care. It should be a state issue. He should be going to the national office to represent Alabama, but he's not. Now it's an issue because I have to worry about if he's an actual child molester, if he's done all these horrible things that come out in the last 6 months of his term, because he's going to dictate policy that's going to affect me and my kids' schooling and how much money I have to give to the government. Shouldn't be that way. So that's why it needs to be repealed. Let me see what else I got here. That's pretty much it. So in terms of that, I talked about the hypocrisy. I did an article a few weeks ago that you should check out. I'll link to it, where Paul Kengor and Daniel Flynn were talking about John McCain's quote of describing the Trump-Putin press conference in Helsinki as one of the most disgraceful performances by an American president in memory. No prior president, insisted McCain, has ever abased himself more abjectly before a tyrant, which is really hilarious because this progressive 17th Amendment was passed during the era where Joe Kennedy was a bootlegger during Prohibition. He was a huge fan of the neo-Nazis, and John F. Kennedy actually came back from Germany praising Hitler as a great, wonderful, intelligent man. And if people don't see that, then they're definitely jealous. When FDR rose to power and passed all these constitutional amendments, it was easier to do before the 17th Amendment was passed, but he was a big fan of Mussolini and thought the guy was just the greatest thing since sliced bread. So a couple of things I want to talk about before we go. Some of the comments on this particular article and other ones that I read are interesting. McCain was a tragic figure. While he was a hero in his youth, he betrayed the Constitution in his latter years and now dies without his conscience being his friend. A terrible fate. May every American profit from it. He never should have voted to approve Breyer or Ginsburg. True. He never should have worked with Obama, and his vote that stopped the repeal of Obamacare was spiteful, treacherous, traitorous, and malicious. Agree or disagree? I'd be curious to hear your thoughts. Another quote, while Trump should not have attacked McCain's war record, McCain's overall political record was atrocious. I go back to him attacking Romney in 2008. McCain's not used to having someone with a bigger stick, and it's been interesting to watch his reaction to someone doing to him what he did to Mitt Romney and others that he ran against in years past, before going to the primary and being seen as the maverick, the guy who could work with both sides, the guy who was there for the people, and basically just sticking out his tongue and licking whatever was in front of him. Now, that's kind of harsh, huh? I'm upset that he spent 30 years in the Senate here. Now Jeff Flake, who can't win again, has to quit, and we're probably going to end up with Kristen Sinema. And I'll probably do an ad or a video about her ads, which are hilarious. She runs these ads where she says nothing. She shows people from diverse backgrounds, talks about how much she loves Arizona, and says nothing. And then it's like her hugging a big group at the end. And then you've got articles about her being a Pravda socialist and the policy she supports. And I thought, well, of course, because she doesn't have to convince a state legislature to send her to Washington. All she has to do is get people who don't pay attention to politics to go, I like her. She's a woman. She's got a vagina. I think she'll do a heck of a job. There goes my vote out the window. I'm not upset about this, as you can tell. Another comment. I've said the same thing about him for years. Why does his death yesterday mean I should suddenly eulogize a man who is a disgrace to this nation from start to finish? I feel sad for his family, but I will not deify this excuse for a man who has so hurt so many families in America for so long. Does it bother you that we deify these people, that we fly flags at half staff, that we do funerals in multiple states, that we televise them, and we lionize them like we did with Senator Kennedy? Thank God. I'm glad he didn't kill anyone in the last 10 years of his Senate run. And I'm glad when McCain did it, was wearing his military fatigues. I'm a conservative Republican. I'm not upset, obviously. I'm a conservative Republican and Arizona resident for over 40 years, and I watched one political shyster after another pill for the Treasury. As far as Senator McCain, he was not a conservative. He was a Republican because there was no shyster box for him to check off. This one's harsh. And he surely never represented any conservative who were left with nothing else to vote for. I took the time to review his military background and discovered the Navy got him because his grandfather and father told him to take him. His atrocious military conduct cost many of his fellow seamen's lives and vast amounts of naval material. The only thing that got him elected in Arizona was getting shot down over Vietnam and held captive, with the account being buttered up by his media fawning over him because they saw him sing a conservative song and then put a knife in the back of conservative voters. Obviously, pretty partisan here. It's always regrettable to hear of a family losing one of its family members, but that's the extent of my sympathy and flag waving. Let's do a couple more. Quote, I get where you're coming from, but hard to overlook that McCain presented FBI with a fake dossier in the recent past, knowing it was created by foreign national Russians. I'm so tired of hearing about dossiers and Russians and Manaforts. And yes, they're bad people with bad intentions. By Hillary attempt to ruin Trump's life and Manafort flood, etc. His actions matter greatly to me. I disagree with the fawning media attention he's received. All right, last one. I'm sorry, but I disagree. These lies about McCain that he pushed for 4 decades need to be countered with the truth. Why do you think he needed a presidential pardon upon returning from Vietnam? Why did he need to have his records from that time of his life sealed? I've read a lot of articles about how that's why they seal records now, was because John McCain set the precedent. Kind of like Amy Schumer on Netflix. Changed the whole review system for the worse. Sad for him, he couldn't seal the minds and mouths of other veterans from that era too. We don't need a deceitful myth. We need the truth about a man who did massive harm to hundreds of American families for far too long. Look, I've thrown a lot of stuff out here, but what I really want to know from you, if you're watching and you made it to the end, is do you believe that the 17th Amendment would prevent people like John McCain from staying in office for so long? My argument is this. If the state legislature decided at any time that McCain-Feingold or the Gang of Eight or McCain not representing the interests of the Arizona voters had become a concern that they could no longer live with, they could recall him. Senator McCain would be done with the Senate, would go on to make his way in the regular free market capitalist economy to see how he did in the real world. We wouldn't have the 30-year circus parade that we have now when they die, which will certainly have with every other senator that comes afterwards, because he spent 40 years in public service, enriching himself and basically ignoring, in McCain's case, ignoring the needs of the majority of voters in his state. The other side of the argument is, this one's kind of hard to say, because right now with the state legislature situation, if the state legislatures were sending their own representatives, the Senate would probably be at least 70% to 30% Republican representation. You can argue that the state legislatures might have a different mix-up if we voted that way, but I think the evidence is pretty clear that it would be a higher reflection of the actual needs of those states based on the constituencies in the states themselves, which is probably the reason I think it'll never happen. But what I want is for people to talk about it. So do you agree or disagree? Let me know in the comments that we need to repeal the 17th Amendment. Do you agree or disagree that we should prevent, and the founders would agree that we should never have people like John McCain staying in office for 30 years? It should be like it was in George Washington's time, where basically people say it's your civic duty, go and serve, use your leadership and talents to make this country great, make it better. And the person reluctantly goes and says, I'm not doing it to get rich. I'm not doing it for fame. I'm doing it because it's my duty. And I owe America a debt of gratitude for the great things she's given me. They go, they serve once, they serve twice, and they represent this chart. Why am I still on the full screen here? They represent this chart, which shows us that for the first 80 years or so, most of the people served a term or two, and they went back home, went about their business, and died with dignity. They didn't do what John McCain did, which is hold the seat hostage, even when he had brain cancer, to make sure that he had a semblance of control of what happened with that seat, and therefore his legacy. Let me know if you agree with that. And with the most biting line that I sometimes use when McCain frustrates me, which is, look, this is a man who learned very well how to take hostages, and he's been doing it with Arizona for 30 years. We should not allow this to happen again. The state's rights and the rights of the constituents are too important to leave to someone who's got a 90% incumbency rate that we cannot get rid of. So that's it for today. Let me know your thoughts below. And if you're a new subscriber, thanks for joining me. I do interviews once a week, and then I do rants whenever I can, once the kids are in bed, like right now, late at night. So I appreciate you joining me, and I'll see you in the comments. Thanks. My friends, my fellow Americans, Obama is none of those things you say. He's a good man, and it's an honor to concede the victory to him. Thank you.